Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we have the humbling privilege to get to speak with Wade Davis, professor of anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. Between 2000 and 2013, he served as Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society and was named by NGS as one of the Explorers for the Millennium. He has been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all of life's diversity, and his work has taken him to unique biomes across the world, including East Africa, Borneo, Nepal, Peru, Polynesia, Tibet, Mali, Benin, Togo, New Guinea, Australia, Colombia, Vanuatu, Mongolia, and the high Arctic of Nunavut and Greenland, just to name a few. An ethnographer, writer, photographer, and filmmaker, Davis holds degrees in anthropology and biology and received his PhD in ethnobotany, all from Harvard University. Through the Harvard Botanical Museum, he spent 3 years in the Amazon and the Andes as a plant explorer, living amongst 15 indigenous groups in 8 Latin American nations while making some 6,000 botanical collections. He is the author of 320 scientific and popular articles, 23 books, and as a professional speaker for 30 years, he has lectured at over 200 universities and 250 corporations and professional associations. One of only 20 honorary members of the Explorers Club, his incredible list of awards, medals, and accolades would warrant a podcast of its own. We've connected here today to introduce the Mushroom Hour audience with this incredible explorer, give some of his background, and dive into his newest powerful work about one of the most biodiverse and culturally relevant countries in the world, Colombia, and its great river, the Magdalena. Wade, it's truly an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thanks, Darren, for having me.
Well, I am really excited. We could talk about so many different topics. Someone like you on the show who's experienced and researched so many different aspects of ethnobotany, anthropology. So if it were up to me, we'd spend 8 hours just peppering you with questions, but we will try to focus in a little bit. And without going through your whole biography, what really influenced you in your study of anthropology to explore entheogens and ethnobotany? I think famously, you were the one that really uncovered for the Western world the Haitian zombie phenomenon, which actually a lot of people know about now. But what pushed you in that direction?
Well, I think I came under the influence, very fortunately, of 2 remarkable mentors at college at Harvard. At the time when I was a student in the early 1970s, there was a kind of a chasm between biology and anthropology, whereby the naturalists, particularly with the emerging conservation biology movement, sort of saw people as part of the problem, indigenous people in particular. And the anthropologists couldn't abide the misanthropic elitism as they saw it in the environmentalists or naturalists, right?
Right.
And I was very fortunate to have 2 mentors from both sides of that spectrum. On the one hand, the legendary botanical explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico, as they came to be known in 1938. And on the other hand, David Maybury-Lewis, who was both a great humanist, but also one of the great Americanists in terms of social anthropology, and ultimately the founder of cultural survival. And in that sense, David very much came out of the activist tradition in anthropology that we can trace in a very interesting way back to Franz Boas and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. Schultes was a man who inspired by the charisma of his deeds, not the intellectual depth of his imagination. And so Schultes is sort of inspired by the example of his deed, extraordinary, true explorer who slipped away into the Northwest Amazon in 1945, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living among unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the near-tropical forest. And David, by contrast, inspired by the wonder of his ideas, deep humanism, his understanding of the fundamental necessary of anthropology, something very simple. Every culture has something to say, each deserves to be heard. There was a famous moment at Harvard in 1979 when the Dalai Lama wound up his first ever tour of America, and he spoke last at Harvard University. And that very night, kitty cornered to the hall where the Dalai Lama was to speak, E.O. Wilson, legendary naturalist and biologist and author, father of the notion of biodiversity, was introducing Norman Myers, who was a Kenyan scholar who had written a book called The Thinking Ark, one of the first books to anticipate the emerging biodiversity crisis. And all the students and faculty, of course, would cross the street to listen to His Holiness. And in apologizing to the sparse audience, Wilson, as kind and decent a man as you could find, who would regret these words to this day, said, if even Harvard students can get the priorities right, I would apologize to you. And they'd rather be crossed away listening, quote, to that religious kook. You know how far we've got to educate at large. Now, that sounds so unlike Ed, such a beautiful man, but it was actually typical of this era when I went to graduate school, where there was this chasm between the social sciences and the natural sciences, right? And I must have been the only student that night, because of the influence of Schultes and David Maybury-Lewis, who was running back and forth between each talk. The irony is that, flash forward to your generation, Aaron, the space shot of your generation has been a journey into the very fiber of our being, whereby geneticists have shown without doubt genetic endowment of humanity continuum. We're all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of Africa 5,000 years ago. Every population has the same genius. How they express that genius, therefore, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the affairs of culture. We don't go as a Victorian thought that is civilized with a strand of London and so on. The amazing thing is that science has come to the fore to prove the veracity of the central tenet of American social anthropology, and that was cultural relevance. The idea that the other peoples of the world aren't failing you. But every culture needs an answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean human alive? And they answer that question and do so in 7,000 words of humanity. Those answers, of course, collectively become a human repertoire, dealing with all the challenges that will confront us. But I make that point to stress that in the early days, that wasn't so clear. And these sort of disciplines were opposed to each other to the extent to which I went through 18 years at Harvard, undergraduate and various graduate degrees. I can't believe that I never took a course from Ed Wilson, who's now not just one of my mentors, he's one of my absolute heroes, as he deserves to be the hero of the entire 20th century. It was that divided. That was very lamentable. But certainly it gave me that tremendous sense, critically, as we all know now, that the very forces eroding biological diversity are the same forces that are corroding cultural diversity.
So your research started in this time of flux. Time of flux and disparate ideas in the scientific community. That must have been tough for someone to reconcile.
Well, it was just the world you were in, and it was very intellectually alive. I felt like, in retrospect, of course, predictably at the time I was too young and stupid to realize how lucky I was. But looking back, I just can't believe that I had the good fortune to fall into the orbit of such extraordinary scholarly mentors. It's the stuff out of legends. It's one of the reasons, Darren, that as a professor today, and the reason I became a professor, I didn't join the academy until I was 59 years old. I was an independent scholar, a writer, a filmmaker. I only went back to the university system only to be a teacher, only in thinking about what these men had meant to me. And that's why at the University of British Columbia today, for example, the young students are kind of astonished that I answer every single email immediately and I'm right on top of it. And I try to do for them what Schultes and David did for me. And after 7 years of doing this, I get these fantastic messages from dear professor, remember you said to follow your heart? Well, I did. I'm living in the outback of Australia with a tribal group. I've learned the language. I've been adopted. I'm now coming home. Or another one I got recently was, dear Profi, you remember what you said? I'm so glad you answered all your emails, because if you didn't answer mine, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, and I'm walking around the world.
Wow. Yeah.
I'll tell you, one of the things that is interesting to recall, that's almost impossible for your generation to appreciate because you didn't live it, in the same way that, when I first went to South America as a young lad of 20 years old, I was there 15 months and I called home once,
Inconceivable.
and that was when I heard that my father had had a heart attack. When you left, you left. And we forget that in the year that I went to Colombia for the first time in 1968, and probably still in 1974 when I returned as a young scholar, the vast majority of the world's population had never been in an airplane, and that included Canadians and Americans. And when I came back from the Amazon after 15 months in 1975, hard for you to believe, Darren, but I could mention to 1,000 people in the States or Canada that I've just come back from the Amazon, and it would have drawn an absolute blank stare. I mean, I might as well have said I've come back from Mars or something, or I've come back from Brooklyn. I mean, it was not even a place that was on anybody's radar. And that just shows you sort of how fast things have changed. But certainly in a more serious sense, inspired by my own values and growing up in that era, many anthropologists of my generation became anthropologists because we saw in our own society much that was problematic. An ongoing war in Vietnam, ongoing racial tensions that have not been resolved to this day, the ill treatment of women, the ill treatment of gay people, hideous attitudes towards the natural world in terms of the dearth of environmental regulation and so on and so forth. And we all sort of suffered from Baudelaire's disease, which was horror of home. And we went out looking for a place where we perhaps could forge more authentic lives. And that wasn't really a scholarly, intellectual impetus, but it was a personal impetus that always sort of, in my mind, linked the search for knowledge and the search for a vocation. I've always seen a vocation not as a job, but as a set of glasses, a lens upon which to look at the world, and only for a time. I mean, in the same way that every time I write a new book, the reviewers say, this is quite a departure for Wade Davis. I've never thought that a career was something you try on like a cloak. For a while I was a park ranger. For a while I was a logger. I've been a big game hunting guide. I've been a river guide. I've also been a botanical explorer. I've been a filmmaker. I've studied zombies. I've studied shamanism. I've also studied the way of life of people from any number of other places in the world. In other words, to me, the goal in life is to be both the architect of that life, but also to, go through life with your eyes wide open to wisdom, like a sage.
And as an anthropologist, you're keenly aware, as you state in your book, that the only constant really is change. And when you look at the great thinkers and the great naturalists, many of which appear in your book, but so many others, they are Renaissance men and women. I think it was Ernest Hemingway that said specialization is for insects. Humans are designed to be able to go and flow between all these different disciplines.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, one of the tragedies of the modern scientific experiment is that, scholars are condemned to know more and more about less and less.
Yes.
When you look at the great scholars of the 19th century, and even in the early years of the 20th century, insights in one field kind of slipped effortlessly into another. A classic example would be Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology. He was a physicist training in Germany a short generation after Einstein, and he studied the optics of light and water, and in a kind of a curious way, perception came to obsess him, and he slipped into the realm of thinking about people and asking how perceptions forge our sense of who we are. And before you knew it, he had founded American anthropology as we know it. And one of the things that I did receive from both of my mentors, Schultes was never a conservationist, an environmentalist in a contemporary sense of the word. I mean, he was a 19th century man in so many ways. But that said, he was the very first person to shout to the world that the knowledge of indigenous people, particularly the botanical knowledge, was easily equal to that of any academically trained scholar in the West. At a time when most indigenous people in the Northwest Amazon, for example, had only encountered missionaries who wanted to transform their souls, or rubber agents who wanted to exploit their labor, or military who wanted to exploit and brutalize their daughters. Schultes came along as a solitary student of plants in 1941 recognizing the shaman as a true natural philosopher. And he went into the forest not as a master, but as a student. And that deep humility was something that was extraordinarily rare in that era, when most European quote unquote explorers, carried their enameled self-confidence and sense of cultural superiority with them wherever they went in the world. And of course, David had been inspired by the activism tradition. Let me try to explain. Anthropology is sometimes seen as a sort of quirky thing that's sort of analogous to traveling a lot and living with kind of interesting people, which is something we all like to do.
Right. It sounds like one big vacation sometimes.
Yeah, but it's something much more serious. Think of this for a second, Aaron. Go back to the life of perhaps your great-grandfather, before World War I, and just reflect on his certitudes. What he thought about the role of men, the place of women, what he thought about people of color, what he thought about the nature of the family, what he thought about the human right to reflexively exploit every resource on the planet. I could go on and on.
Yeah.
Now, take what you believe, and not one of those certitudes would you endorse. And in fact, many of them you'd find to be morally questionable, right? And all these movements that you've ridden in your life, whether it's the movement has taken women, your sisters, your girlfriends, from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay friends from the closet to the altar, the fact that you grew up with the word biodiversity spinning in your mouth, that you were aware of Gaia, you knew what it meant to see the Earth from space, all that stuff. If you, for example, find it quite normal that a friend of yours from China is interested in the Judaic tradition, or that a Jewish friend from Tel Aviv is pursuing the breadth of the Dharma, or that you've got a black friend who's got a white girlfriend, or you've got friends, two guys who have two beautiful babies, and you understand that the nature of family is love, not gender identity or whatever. If you understand what it meant, that marvelous young African-American girl who not that long ago said in response to Black Lives Matter that, you want to talk about Confederate monuments. I, in the color of my skin, am a monument to the Confederacy because my body tells you that my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandmother was raped by an overseer. I'm the monument to the Confederacy. If you understand what she meant by that, you are a child of anthropology. Because these social movements, yes, they progress through social protest, through action, through changing technologies, in the case of, say, the development of the pill, which liberated women in so many ways. But you have to go back to ask what initially cracked open the orthodoxy of the Edwardian mind. What set of ideas allowed these later social movements to develop? And incredibly, it was really the notions brought into being by this strange little group of contrarian academics who were haunted by the FBI, refused academic promotion, but maintained some fundamental ideas that the nature of love is what creates a family, not the identity of the mother and the father in terms of gender. That manners don't make the man, men and women create the manners. Cultures are a product of their own history, that race is an absolute social and cultural construct with no biological rationale whatsoever. Those ideas, which we take for granted, did not exist until Boaz gathered around him this extraordinary cadre of scholars, most of them women. Ruth Benedict, who said the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. Zora Neale Hurston, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and Ella Deloria. So this anthropology isn't just an esoteric field of discipline. It is the kernel of modernity. It is the reason we can have the ideas that we have today. Boaz, in particular, deserves absolutely to rank with Einstein, Freud, and Darwin as the four great pillars of the intellectual foundation of modernity.
And that takes anthropology also away from just a static study of peoples, or like you're saying, some kind of esoteric notion. It's an active, living, thought-provoking, and really narrative-changing and society-shifting discipline, because the thoughts, motivations, beliefs, certitudes, narratives that we tell define our history. So, not only is it a great lens by which we can examine the history of peoples and how they developed relationships with place and all of those things that we get into in your book, but they also can make change by really understanding these ideas, these certitudes, these beliefs, and then helping to develop new ones.
Well, I mean, that is so well spoken. So listen, why does any of this matter? I wrote a book called The Wayfinder. The editor put a snappy title on why ancient wisdom matters in the modern world. I didn't really like the title because it implied that these societies were visual. They're not. They're dynamic living partners in our own collective quest for the future. But I answer that question with two words: climate. And that wasn't just that we go back to a pre-industrial past, that any indigenous people or any people be kept away from the best achievements of modernity, allopathic medicine or technology to internet or whatever. But the very existence of these other ways of being puts a lie to those of us who are cultural traditions who consistently say that we cannot change, as we know we must change the fundamental way we interact with the planet. We think of ourselves as being the dominant way of thinking, because all cultures are culturally myopic, faithful to their own interpretation of reality. But the ubiquity and the power of the Western paradigm should not imply that it represents the norm. To the contrary, it's the exception. And the triumph of secular materialism may be the conceit of modernity, but it doesn't suggest that it should be the dominant voice of our lives today. We come from a tradition in which, as we liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, we throw away all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor. Descartes said that all that exists is material and matter. If it cannot be measured, it cannot exist. The idea that a mountain could be a deity is ridiculous, ridiculous. And the result of it is that we de-animated the world. Science, as Saul Bellow said, made house cleaning unquote. We see the earth as essentially a stage set on which the human drama unfolds exclusively, with plants and animals as props on our stage set. No other intellectual tradition in the world thinks like that. Almost every other culture bases its relationship with the natural world not on an extractive materialistic model, but on a model of reciprocity. Simple equation. The earth owes people its bounty, but people owe their fidelity to the earth. People are not the problem, they're the solution. Because only through the dignity of the earth, the recognized, acknowledged, and serviced, if you will. And so what does this mean in real terms? Well, if you and I, Darren, are raised in a culture that views the mountain simply a pile of rock, ready to be mined, we don't hesitate to tear it apart. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. You were probably raised in Northern California, thinking the redwoods were 4 feet in cellulose. That made you and me different than the First Nations who saw those forests as the abode of spirits that had to be embraced in the initiation rites. Now, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. Is a forest or thief? Is a forest domain of the divine? The interesting thing is how the belief system mediates the relationship between the population and that natural resource with profoundly different consequences for the ecological system. That is a powerful lesson that we need to learn.
And that idea of seeing the mountain as a living being, that's something that I think as science progresses, I'm always struck by. We really come to understand the truth in that. It's funny because some of these ancient wisdoms and ways of seeing animated landscapes, especially through the lens of fungi, but when we start to get this understanding of community ecology, we start to realize, yes, there is a spirit of that mountain. Those organisms have evolved together. They may even be unique from the next mountain range. So that's really interesting. And what I'm hearing is how important it is to have anthropologists in a culture, because you need to have that. I think there's this all important process of grammar in anything we do. We need to take in and aggregate lots of disparate information to come to the best possible solution. So, when you're stuck in a culture where, like a fish in water, you don't always know how it's influenced you because it's just the way it is. How important is it to have people that are able to look outside of that and say, our culture runs this way, but look at the insights from this culture? Not that they might be right or wrong, but how does that balance out and challenge our certainties and our way of being?
I think, boy, you're just such a smart kid. I mean, these are really great questions. Obviously, we all are extraordinarily excited about the idea of indigenous people finally becoming ethnographers of their own lives,
Yes.
telling their own stories. But there's still, as you suggest, a role for the interlude. The individual who is trained to sort of be a conduit of culture, be a vehicle by which other people can come to understand that culture. I mean, for example, in my work with voodoo, there is no way on earth that I know much about voodoo beliefs as a voodoo Houdon, voodoo priest, or even a Bokor, a sorcerer, negative. But I may nevertheless be able to distill out of the phantasmagoric realm of belief that comprises the great religious tradition of West Africa. I can distill themes out of that and express and communicate the nature of the essence of the religion, arguably better than many voodoo priests would be able to do, because they can't step outside of the closest, in the sense of their beliefs. And similarly, back to your point, when it's someone like remember the Kogi, the Arawakos, the elder brothers, say that, water in a river is no different than blood in the veins of a body. They're not really speaking about metaphor, because it's absolutely true. One of the extraordinary things about water that very few people understand is that water is never created nor destroyed. The same amount of water that is on the earth today is exactly the same amount of water that was on the earth as it slaked the thirst of the dinosaurs. Water can be poisoned. It can be transformed in state from gaseous to liquid to solid, and it can go back the other direction, if you will. But it's never created nor destroyed. And in fact, all of us are destined to be part of the fundamental hydrological cycle, whereby fluid evaporates into clouds, clouds condense to drop precipitation back onto the land. And back to your example of the fungi. And when I left college in the mid-'70s, and I was sort of figuring out what to do with myself, and I found myself in Haida Gwaii. I was working as a park ranger, and September came along, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. I wasn't ready to go back to graduate school. And so I took a job in a tough logging camp, because I felt like if I was going to be critical of industrial deforestation and clear cutting, I ought to know something about it. And
right.
In that year I lied about my credentials, and I got on as a forestry engineer, which was a fantastic window into the entire operations of those logging camps. And in that entire year, I can assure you that not one decision was made by our staff that took any element of an ecological concern into account.
Right.
But my point is, that was only the 1970s, at a time when, with enormous hubris, the foresters of British Columbia were propagating a myth, the entire myth of industrial forestry, which was trying to suggest that it was something that it was not. Scientific forestry was never about science. It was always about rationalize. It was an ideology to rationalize the wholesale destruction of the forest. I mean, sustained yield forestry was predicated on the eradication of all the old growth timber. We use terms like decadent and over-mature timber to describe forests that were at their richest state in terms of biodiversity. We harvested forests that had never been planted. I could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
But my point is, if you had told me then what we now know about the nature of mycelial networks in an old growth forest on the coast of British Columbia, I would have been chased out of that engineering office as some kind of lunatic, new age fantasy, right?
Right.
And now we know through the work of people like Paul Stamets and the incomparable Suzanne Simard at UBC, that these mycelial networks are the fundamental foundation of the ecosystem. That you step your boot onto a bit of soil in any forest, and you're stepping on 300 miles of fungal mycelial mat, that individual trees are able to shunt nutrients back to denizens of their own genetic heritage deliberately, consciously in some kind of sense. So, in other words, I think one of the lessons in all of this is always to be cautious about the hubris of science. I mean, I think of it in terms of the early days of heroic medicine. I just love the image of George Washington's death, not his death, but what was happening around him. These sort of, fat, bespectacled silk waistcoated men with hooked noses and strange wigs who stood by his bedside as they very confidently administered doses of arsenic and mercury, while at the side, another one of them drew 3 pints of blood out of the founding father's body, and then they wondered why he died that day from a common cold. In other words, but the arrogance with which they did it, and so I think there's some humility there, also in the way we treat the natural world. I mean, the confidence by which people deny climate change or promote industrial activities as being benign. All of this we should come with a warning, important if true.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what so interests me about the study of mushrooms, fungi, and mycology. And honestly, that's what compels me to share the amazing work of people like yourself and so many of the people I talk to, is I think it gives people, because mycology is so new and it's actively changing the narratives we tell as a culture. I think it's doing that in a huge way right now. It gives us a chance to re-examine everything, and it gives the average person a chance to engage with science and maybe start understanding the world from a more scientific, a holistic perspective when it comes to the environment, and kind of empowering people to challenge the kind of narratives that have been in place that have mainly been for economic benefit, or have mainly been rationalizations. The modern person now, armed with a knowledge of mycology, a basic knowledge of citizen mycology, is able to challenge that, at least in their own lives, and make better decisions. And so I guess from hearing what you're saying, mushrooms and fungi really excite me by their ability to change human narratives. And I think, since you were in that exciting fabric of the 70s where people were in this anthropological hive of Harvard, how much change has happened because of the new insights and narrative and stories that your mentors told.
Well, I think that's another wonderful point you're making, Darren. Let me answer that in two stages, because you made sort of two interesting points there. One is about science. I went off to the Amazon and fell into the orbit of Tim Plowman, who was Schultes' great protege. And that's how I was exposed to botany. And until then, even though I had been a nature lover all my life, working in the mountains as a park ranger, naturalist, I didn't know anything about botany. And a forest was just sort of a glorious series of shades of green. But then once I began to understand taxonomy, the plants, each of them had a lineage, each had a family. The phylogenetic history of the botanical realm became a roadmap to the past. They became like friends, and the scientific names were not difficult to remember. I remembered them as effortlessly as I learned your name days ago. Tim used to say, when you recite the Latin names, you're reciting the names of the gods. But my point is that I was a third-year university student before I ever studied any science whatsoever. I could have slipped through Harvard with an illustrious degree and never have been exposed to the formula for photosynthesis. I mean, I can't believe it. And when I did become turned on to plants, and I came back and I jumped into scholarly botanical study intensely, I was like a demon. The night that I understood the Krebs cycle, the cycle of respiration, or perhaps it was photosynthesis, I could memorize these complex metabolic pathways effortlessly because I was old enough that they all read like creation myths to me. And I remember the night, I think it was the night, maybe it was either respiration, Krebs cycle, or photosynthesis. I was thrown out of the science library at Harvard for disrupting the peace. The police came and got me because I was so ecstatic. I was on this high. I started racing around the room, screaming at people, do you realize that plants can eat light? All it takes is a photon of light and they can transform carbon dioxide and water into the food we eat and oxygen we breathe. I mean, that seems so silly that came to me that late in life. But how many of our politicians know that formula, right? They make how many people on the far right make their children recite biblical verse? But what about botanical verse, the foundation of life itself? And you cannot begin to critique science if you don't understand anything about it. And scientific illiteracy is one of the haunting kind of chasms in the public repertoire, the toolkit of our communities. I'm haunted to this day by the possibility that I could have gone through life without understanding biology. Fortunately, I ended up, even though I never took a biology course in my life until third year in university, I ended up getting my PhD in biology from Harvard because it turned me on so much.
Yeah.
Now, what was the second point of your oh, mushrooms. Well, one of the things that I find it fascinating, our museum at Harvard was sort of the world center for the study of both medicinal, toxic, and hallucinogenic plants. Because of that, I was so fortunate to fall into the orbit of not only people like Tim Plowman and the inimitable Andrew Weil, both of whom were like big brothers to me. And that's why I wrote the book One River, to connect Schultes and Tim for all time. But also because of Schultes, I got to know Albert Hoffman and Sasha Shulgin and Gordon Wasson.
Wow.
And these were the legends of this sort of interesting cadre of characters from all walks of life who came together at a time when no one had taken these substances in the modern era. They had no reference points or points of judgment to filter their experiences. And they were this eclectic group of scholars. Now, I fell into that orbit. I became enchanted and interested in these substances, as did so many of my generation, in part by scholarly research, but also because I was an individual seeker,
right,
as so many of us were. I would say that fundamentally I fell into the sort of the Richard Albert camp. Richard Albert, of course, becoming Ram Dass, who became a great friend of mine, wonderful man. And Ram Dass always, said, get the message, hang up, which is sort of what George Harrison did, or Paul McCartney. You talked, how many times, some people would say, how many times you have to take LSD to get the message, get the message and then figure out how to get to those spaces in another way. Other people, Tim Leary, who's been much unjustly demeaned, to John Lennon, perhaps, whatever, to my friends, Dennis McKenna, who find, and many people find, that the ongoing periodic and judicious use of psychedelics is part of their process in life. And I don't judge either camp. It's whatever works for you. But this I will say, I not only am proud to say that I took psychedelics, I say that I wouldn't think the way I think, I wouldn't write the way I write, I never would have understood cultural relativism as soon as I did. I wouldn't relate to the natural world as I do. I wouldn't relate to women or people of color or gay people as I do had I not taken psychedelics. They were absolutely catalytic in my life. And at the time, of course, my parents famously said, don't take these things. You'll never come back the same. Our
right.
parents didn't understand. That was the whole bloody...
that was the good part.
That was the good part. And it raises this issue that these substances are inherently subversive. Remember that the global distribution of plant entheogens is very interesting. 90% are found only in the Americas, and a couple found in Siberia. Not because the forests of Ecuador, West Africa were depaupered or Southeast Asia. People there had other avenues to divine. The use of these substances is one means of satisfying the ubiquitous human appetite, which periodically, some technique of ecstasy, is gained for the moment human consciousness. And that can be meditation or heal, dancing, whatever. And these plants serve that role, but they're largely exploited in the Americas. And they're also generally associated with small hunting-gathering, shamanic-based religious beliefs. And in that sense, it makes a lot of sense, because what the plants do is what the shaman's trying to do, which is facilitate the individual's wild genius and escape and ascent to the realm of the divine, if you will. Joseph Campbell makes that great distinction between the shaman and the priest, who by contrast has a political role to incorporate the individual into a greater collective, a congregation, which can be subject to the ideological forces of the state or
right.
of the greater common. And so these psychedelics have always been wildly subversive. And so it's not just because Nixon wanted to create a wedge between a frightened middle class that became known as the silent majority when he started his war on drugs, which you know from Harlequin's memoir, had nothing to do with concern about drug use, everything to do with finding a wedge issue that could mobilize silent majority who were terrified because they were terrified of God and hated people of color, I mean, that's why they went after Tim Leary. I mean, Tim Leary was in San Quentin Federal Penitentiary for years, much of the time in solitary confinement, for the crime of having possessed a joint of marijuana. People are unfair to Tim because they forget that he was a very thoughtful social psychologist. There was a moment of crisis in the discipline whereby a study had come out saying that no matter what the psychiatric challenge, a third of people got better, and the intervention, a third got better, a third stayed the same, a third got worse. And right at that kind of moment of intellectual crisis, he read Life magazine, in which Gordon Wasson reported the ingestion of these substances, which a clever editor called the magic mushroom. He made a beeline to Cuernavaca and he took mushrooms, and his life was transformed. In that sense, that was a real moment in the psychedelic era born. But again, these substances are inherently subversive, but transcendently interesting. And again, we have to ask the obvious question. After, but now almost 50 years of a war on drugs, the expenditure of $1 trillion, with millions of lives ruined by death, by injury, or by addiction, or by incarceration, there are more people using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. And yet, what is it about the indigenous people? What do they know about using these substances, which have allowed them to be used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for thousands of years? Well, they use these substances in natural forms, which are pharmacologically safest. They recognize the use of these substances is a legitimate thing to do, done carefully, and they protect the individual with a protective cloak of ritual that insulates the individual from some of the dazzling effect of the substances.
Right.
So, there's a lot to learn about the use of these substances from indigenous people. And, in a strange way, where all this comes together, I think, is Colombia. Colombia, its dark reputation as celebrated in Narcos and other TV series. Colombia is, to this day, the nation with the greatest biodiversity, given its geographical area on Earth. There are more native people alive today with numbers than at the time of contact. Colombia has done more to recognize or level the legitimacy of indigenous aspirations than almost any other nation state, including setting aside in the northwest Amazon area of land in perpetuity, the size of the United Kingdom, of ethnicities of that region. And so, Colombia, it's not an accident. Colombia, Schultes as it did in the 1940s, or that it attracted people like himself, Andrew Weil, of course, and Plowman in the 1960s and 70s.
And just on your notes, the amazing cosmology you've laid out on psychedelia and how it's changed our culture. What an incredible anthropological study to see how the influence, and ethnobotanical study to see how the influence of this and the spread of this from South American cultures up to a United States culture that had no reference point, how irrevocably it changed everything about our society. And then 50 years of repression did nothing to really stop those continued changes to where now we're at the edge of a psychedelic renaissance where people are ready to decriminalize these substances, finally ready to integrate them into things like psychological therapy. We're kind of deriving all these methods of responsible use. So for me, who's not a veteran of psychedelics, but I've spoken with many guests who are, and obviously people like yourself who have been intimately involved since the beginning. And just that story is so powerful, and how powerful a change maker they are, that I can't help but think they're going to be an inexorable part of our human experience for the next centuries to come.
People like Dennis McKenna, who, of course, the brother of his late, of Terence, who became almost an avatar of psychology.
Right.
But Dennis is a very serious, thoughtful scholar, and he really sees psychedelics as being, and he's not sort of spouting this off in some kind of new age, mail order mysticism. He really believes that psychedelics may be a key for awakening us, and not a moment too soon. I mean, part of this is just that we've all grown up. People like Dennis and I, who were vagabond young scholars on the back roads of South America, sleeping where our hats fell, have grown up and just because of our age are now sort of in another category of sort of venerable, about to die elder, and people like Steve Jobs, who openly recognized and acknowledged the influence of psychedelics in forming not just one of the most significant companies in the history of capitalism, but also, recognizing the utility and the metaphor of the internet. Obviously, the internet was developed by the Defense Department. And I'm not saying it was developed by Tim Leary.
Right.
This idea of interconnectivity, multidimensional interconnectivity, nonlinear thinking, which is clearly an element in the elaboration of so much in the new technology. It's not an accident that microdosing and that every executive in Silicon Valley bolts off to take psychedelics at Burning Man. These substances continue to inform lives, and they certainly inform my life.
Well, and as much as Western European and European cultures gained wealth from South America during the early conquest that all of us are so familiar with, I can't help but think if the greatest treasure or the greatest wealth will be the gift of these substances, and really the cross-cultural gift of things that our society, I think we often think lacks, which is elders, a conscience, connectivity, spirituality, this materialist worldview that came out of Europe. You have to wonder if the greatest wealth we're going to receive from South America is actually the gift of these substances and the new kind of narratives we're able to tell from them and the way it changes our culture. And that does bring us directly into the book, The Magdalena, which I have to say, for all of my listeners, it is required reading. I mean, it's an incredible book because it tells the story of such an important South American nation that I think so many of us in the United States only know through that one vector of narcos and Pablo Escobar, when really it's the seat of biodiversity. It's the seat of an incredible culture and that narcotics history. And then even further back, a violent history that really we need to take note of and learn lessons from. There's so much value here. And you've talked about, what drew you there, but I guess what called you to write this newest book? Because we hinted at, the book, you spent time there in the 70s. You wrote the book One River, which, as you say in your new book, you found was hugely influential after the fact.
Well, what happened? I wrote this book, One River, which really was a story of mentors and sons and the Amazon then and now and botanical exploration. And it came out in a Spanish edition in Colombia, in Bogota, in 2002, translated beautifully by a Colombian poet. And you wouldn't think that in the moment when Colombia was almost a failed state, a 500 number print run of a book on botanical exploration would hit a nerve, but in time, by word of mouth, it did, and it became kind of like a map of dreams for two generations of young people who couldn't travel. And part of its appeal was that it held a mirror to all that was wonderful in Colombia, and it implicitly denied all of the dark cliches. I mean, I think when we think about Colombia today, we all have a certain obligation. Look, I mean, in the last 50 years, Colombia was racked by a three-way civil war that left 220,000, perhaps 260,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced. But during all that time, in a country of 50 million people, there were never more than 200, 300,000 combatants. So the vast majority of people were caught in the vice of war, critically a war that would not have endured for a week had it not been for the fuel of the flames of war, which was cocaine. Mm-hmm. The last year before the peace agreement was signed in Cartagena in 2016, the FARC, the leftist guerrilla group that was down at that point to maybe 6,000 cadre, mostly kids in search of a free meal, nevertheless made $600 million from extortion and cocaine, much of it from cocaine distribution and taxation. Well, if you give me the Beverly Hills Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc in Southern California. In other words, the engine driving the war was always consumption of cocaine, which reached extraordinary degrees. I mean, at the height of the Colombian Medellin cartel, at a time when the United States government, with all of its technological and military power, was spending $60 billion a year to stop it, the cartel was putting 80 tons of cocaine into America every month, I think it was. They were generating $70 million of profits every day. Their accountants back in Colombia were budgeting $1,000 a week for the purchase of rubber bands just to wrap the money
And
in.
they were budgeting millions to get eaten by rodents just in storage.
Well, I mean, they just literally ran out of places to steal the cash. Now, the point is that the engine driving that trade has always been consumption. Right. Most Colombians have never seen, let alone used, cocaine. And so, you know, there's a certain kind of responsibility on the hands of everybody you know who's either used street cocaine, or think of it this way, how would you or Americans feel if Canada had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across the country, and laws that facilitated the black market trade, but enforcement that did nothing to curtail that trade, such that 85 million Americans would be forced to flee their homes? Well, how would you feel about that? Hardly fair. Well, that's exactly what happened to Colombia. And yet, during all these years of conflict, the country maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, sought restitution with indigenous people, generated and created millions of acres of national park. And even more recently, at a time when the American government is building a wall across the southern border and denying support or charity to desperate mothers and their starving children who have fled the political chaos of Central America that was set in motion by U.S. foreign policy in the 1980s and continues to be chaotic because of the U.S. consumption of cocaine. While we are denying and putting in cages young people, the Colombian government has welcomed, housed, fed, given medical support and education to no fewer than 1.8 million Venezuelan refugees. So in a sense, I believe that Colombia deserves at least our goodwill, if not our active support. And so when that book, One River, came out, it prompted all kinds of interesting things, including an initiative by a group of botanists and journalists and photographers called Botanica, which was supported by a major corporate citizen, Grupo Argos. And they had put together 5 beautiful books on each of the 5 major regions of Colombia: the Eastern Plains, the Llanos, the Amazon, the Western Chilco, or the rainforest, the Central Andean Cordillera, and the Caribbean Coastal Plain. And these books weren't to be sold, but to be gifted to every library in the country to send a message to a new generation of young people that theirs was not a country of violence and drugs, but a place of the greatest natural beauty, ecological, geographical, and biological diversity on the planet. There is no place in Colombia more than one day removed from every known ecosystem to be found on the planet. There is no nation on earth that can come close to. I'll tell you, I was with a campesino, this guy that I used to call Morita de los Manatees, Morita of the Manatees. He was like an avatar of manatees. He just
one of my favorite characters in the book.
Yeah. You know, he didn't he was so powerful, inspired by nature. And whether it was the paramilitaries or the FARC would come through his village, he just stood them down. And it's amazing he didn't get killed. He felt that he walked with God. But one day he loved school children. And though he was not educated himself, he would take kids on these nature walks. And he told me one day that, around a small wetland that you could sort of circle in a day, they had found 75 different species of butterflies. Well, that's like a third or a half the number of butterflies in a country like Canada, vastly bigger. And I said that to him in amazement. And Mauricio said to me, sí, pero hermano, tiene que entender que la cosa es que en Colombia, mariposa es solamente un flor que puede volar. Es por eso que tenemos tanto. And what he was saying is, he says, yes, but my friend, my brother, you have to understand that in Colombia, a butterfly is just a flower that knows how to fly. That's why we have so many. Well, that to me perfectly distills the essence of this wonderful country. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is celebrated as sort of the founder, if you will, of the inspiration for magical realism, the style of writing that has become associated with Latin American literature. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize for literature.
He was called the greatest Colombian of all time by the president in
Yeah.
2014.
And he's certainly probably one of them. But the point is that he was actually a journalist, an observer who just wrote about what he saw. But he just happened to live in a land where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis. Magical realism is just journalism in Colombia.
And we're talking about biodiversity. I've spoken with various guests about Ecuador, and I've kind of started to understand how much biodiversity still lies in South America that we aren't really taught about in the U.S. It's not in our cosmology of what South America is as really this biodiversity hotspot, unique in the world almost. In Colombia, it's just some of the stats from the book. You have more orchids and endemics than anywhere else on the planet. You have 10% of the biological wealth of the entire planet in this country. What is it? And you just laid out some of the different biomes, but what is it about Colombia that just makes it such a great home? Well, causes it to be such a hotbed of biodiversity.
Well, it's obviously a crossroads of continents. You've got the Central American influences coming in, you've got Caribbean influences, you've got the Amazon, you've got the Andean Cordillera with breaks and really great arms coming out of the Colombian coast. And because, of course, the Amazon used to flow to the Pacific, when the Andes very recently formed geological time, mountain chain, when it rose up, it isolated the forest that now we call the Chocó on the west coast of Pacific coast of Colombia. A way to put this is just in terms of plant collecting. A botanist in the United States, we're a botanist in the United States to find a new species of vascular plant. It would be kind of an event of a lifetime. But in Colombia, naturalists stumble upon new species virtually every day they're in the field. Not every day, but with regularity. I collected dozens of new species of plants without even knowing what I was looking at. I just was in interesting places where botanists hadn't gone before. You raised the point of Ecuador. This is a really essential point about Colombia's at the crossroads today. I did a lot of research in Ecuador in the 1970s. I lived with a number of indigenous people, the Sioniscoy, the Quichua, the Guarani, the Shuar, Pufan. Ecuador made decisions in the 1970s to develop the Oriente, the lowland forests of the Amazon, with oil development, pipelines, of course, with roads, colonization, deforestation. And in good measure, the Oriente has been severely compromised. One good thing that came out of the 50 years of war in Colombia is that vast regions of the country were off limits to industrial development simply because of the conflict. And so, quite accidentally, or in a sense, Colombia was given this massive reprieve. And now it has awoken to the fact that, for example, the Colombian Amazon, although now under threat, is close to the size of the country of France, and it remains utterly without a road. And so Colombia is in this place where it can make decisions about the fate of its natural landscape in an atmosphere in which young people have come to understand that the patrimony of the country is the wealth of the mountain in terms of biodiversity. And it can do so informed by 50 years of scientific research as to the importance of biodiversity that simply wasn't available to the Ecuadorians when they made that fateful decision.
And as you talked about in that interesting juxtaposition between a country that's experienced so much violence and destabilization, but then has had governments and especially certain people within the governments that have made brave decisions that really go down the right path. And I think to illustrate what you're talking about, where they're at this crossroads, you mentioned in the book a 2016 decision, not for the Magdalena, but another river in Colombia, that they decided that the river had natural rights. Now, what kind of precedent does that set? And is that something in Colombia that gives you some kind of hope that the right environmental decisions will be made?
Well, the challenge is that, one of the reasons, we back to the story, I helped the folks with Botanica, and at luncheon one day I sort of said, well, now we've done the land, let's do the rivers without hesitation. They said, fine. I said, well, let's do the Magdalena. Now, the Magdalena is the Mississippi of Colombia. It's a corridor of commerce. It's the mountain of culture. But it's been betrayed by the people in a certain sense. Fouled by human waste and by various effluents and so on. And in a way, the country, even though you can absolutely argue that not only is the Magdalena the key to understanding Colombia, the valley where 80% of the people live and where 80% of the economy is generated, it's sort of forgotten. It's been forgotten. There's an expression in Spanish that we've turned our back to the river. And Colombia's, even myself, as a young botanical explorer, even Schultes, we crossed the Magdalena 1,000 times en route to the deep forest of the hinterland, in Guaviare and Valpez and Amazonas and Chocó. And for example, in the book One River, which stretches to almost 700 words in the Spanish edition, the word Magdalena turns up 5 times, in other words. So for me, I had shared Colombia's sort of amnesia about this river, but it was so ironic because Colombia as a country is the gift of the river. You cannot have one without the other. Carlos Vivas, a friend of mine who's the greatest pop star in Latin America, but he's also a very serious ethnomusicologist. And, as Carlos very put it, he says, all our music, whether it's, poro or merengue or salsa or tambora, comes from cumbia. But cumbia comes from the river, and the river is our music, right? So this is an exploration, and it allows one to both tell the story it's a biography of the whole nation through the metaphor of the river that made possible the nation. But at the same time, it's suggesting that maybe a way to send a message to the world that while the world may be falling apart, but Colombia is falling together would be to clean up the river as a symbol of peace. And it's a nice idea. It's a metaphorical idea. It's a possible idea. But again, the challenge for Colombians is that their regulations on the books in so many ways, environmental laws in particular, are exemplary. But the problem is in a tortuous mountain landscape, perhaps the most difficult on earth, which has always encouraged regionalism, and therefore strong men prepared to exploit mutual reciprocity of hatred, conflict has been endemic. And it's almost impossible for Colombia to embrace peace and move forward unless we have the cleansing stroke of legalization. As long as that thorn in the side of the nation, cocaine, is there, and today there is more coca fields under production, more cocaine being generated than ever before. And it's hard to imagine how the nation state, despite all of its efforts and the remarkable sacrifices of its people, and you have to understand something, every Colombian has suffered. I was once, not long ago in Bogota before COVID, out to lunch with a friend of mine who wanted to introduce me to his wonderful father who had been kidnapped by the FARC and held in a paramo above Bogota. A friend came to lunch with us, and they suddenly realized we were talking, and suddenly the friend said, "Oh, my uncle was held in that same paramo by the FARC." And then a third person arrived and sat down and said, "Oh, my sister was killed in that paramo by the FARC." And it was so shocking because it felt like they had discovered that their family members had gone to the same high school, right? And it gave you a very strong sense of how many Colombians suffered. And they suffered because of our consumption of cocaine. The war, the violence would not have gone on for a minute. The sordid, murderous, blood-soaked paramilitary forces might never have come into being. And the leftists, be it ELN or the FARC, would have fizzled out along with all the other leftist groups that slipped away in Latin America in the wake of the death of Che Guevara at the hands of the CIA back in Bolivia back in the early 60s. In other words, cocaine is what allowed it to happen. Cocaine is the corrosive force that keeps Colombia from realizing its extraordinary destiny. The fact that Colombia has survived as it has, given the circumstances, is simply beyond imaginings. And in that sense, you can tell from this broadcast, Darren, that I'm hardly anti-drug. I'm an utter libertarian. Right. I want all drugs to be legalized. But I'll tell you this, everybody you've ever met, I was doing a speaking thing for Burning Man the other day, and they weren't quite getting this connection to cocaine. And I said, well, have you ever gone to Burning Man? Of course they had. Have you ever used cocaine? Of course they had. Do you ever see cocaine used at Burning Man? Not so much, but it's there. Okay, every one of you is a murderer. Every one of you has blood on your hands. And I feel that very strongly. If you know anything about the fate of the Colombian people, I mean, I happen to think that cocaine is a lousy drug, a drug of ego. very useful as a topical anesthetic for nose, throat, and ear surgery. And maybe if it had been marketed as an analog to what your dentist uses when he pulls a tooth, it wouldn't have become the drug of sexy allure in the 1970s. But it was a perfect drug for that era of personal indulgence and self-obsession. But it's a horrible drug. And the irony of all of this is that the origin of cocaine is Coca, the divine leaf of immortality.
With such a rich ethnobotanical history.
4,000 years, and I'll tell you one important story here. In the 1970s, Tim and I were, thanks to Schultes, we had a grant to study the ethnobotany and botany of Coca and to do what turned out to be the first nutritional study of Coca. The efforts to eliminate Coca plantations began 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. It had nothing to do with cocaine hydrochloride and everything to do with the cultural identity of the people who revered the plant. In Lima in the 1920s, when physicians whose concern for Andean peoples was matched in its intensity only by their ignorance of Indian life, looked up in the Andes and they saw poor nutrition, illiteracy, social pathologies of one form or another, because issues of land distribution and economic injustice challenged too closely the bourgeois foundations of their own lives in Lima, they settled on Coca as a culprit. And yet, in all of those years, 50 years, none of them ever did the obvious, a nutritional study of a plant that was consumed every day by millions of their own people. Had they done that, as Tim Plowman and Andy Wild did in the 1970s, they would have found that Coca is to cocaine as potatoes are to vodka. To condemn coca leaf is like condemning the luscious fruit of a peach because you get cyanogenic poisons inside the pit of a peach. The plant was full of vitamins, more calcium than any other plant ever studied by science, making it perfect for a diet that lacked the dairy product, had enzymes that enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, perfect potato diet. This is a plant that's been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for 4,000 years. This is what we should be celebrating, creating a legal nutraceutical market that will allow the campesinos of Colombia who are going to grow coca, because it's 1,000 times more lucrative than any other cash crop. They're going to grow it. So we need to give them a market to sell their leaves legally and to the benefit of the entire world, because coca reduces coffee and tea and chocolate to caustic, poisonous, unattractive substances. And coca is the divine leaf of immortality, and it could be an incredible export crop for Colombia and a beneficial plant for the entire world. But if I try to bring into the United States today one little bag of coca leaves, they will treat it as if I'm bringing in heroin or cocaine. That's how insane it is.
That's the insanity of prohibition, both in entheogens psychedelics we talked about before and with the miraculous coca plant. And when you read the research about coca as outlined in your book, you come to this realization that I believe it was a 16th century Spanish friar did, which was, how is this not ubiquitous in all of the rest of the world's cultures? It's an absolute miracle plant. So with all the negative externalities that come from this cocaine trade, maybe one of the most significant is we as human societies across the globe aren't using this amazing plant to its maximum benefit.
I find it just amazing, Darren. I mean, I'm no fan of marijuana personally. I think it's called dope for a reason. It makes young people like to say it makes them mellow. Actually, mellow in a dictionary means a state of overripe fruit, and I don't think 16-year-olds should be mellow. But the point is, this is a serious drug. Multi-purpose plant has been used for 4,000 years, but it's a serious drug. Right. And now, having put people in prison for the possession of one joint 10 years ago, now we're sort of selling it like it's candy in stores all across Canada. I find that it's better that it's legal, but I find that shift overnight to be almost bizarre, right? Whereas coca is utterly benign. Now, let me just share you one story that I've never written about that tells you all about this war on drugs. When Tim and I came back, having done this incredible study he was, of course, in charge of, he told me there was a job at the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, that he wanted me to apply for. But he said if I took the job, he'd kill me. And I thought, well, that was interesting. And so I go out to Beltsville, Maryland, and I go to this office, knock on the door opens. I immediately know the guy's not USDA, he's DEA, right? First of all, I notice he's a drug addict because I can't get in the room for the cigarette smoke. Then I see to my amazement that this anti-drug crusader has all his walls covered with seized paraphernalia. It's like going into the office of an anti-pornographer and having pornography on the walls. And then I'm looking at this guy, and it's the 1970s. He's got a big butterfly collar with a hairy chest and gold chains around his neck. His watch has lumps of gold on it. And I said, well, what's his job? The only thing they had distilled from our 2 years of research in the field is that Tim and I were good at finding coca plantations. So he wanted me to go back down to South America, enter the plantations surreptitiously, collect biological pests that predated on the plants, and bring them back so they could be mutated and reintroduced to kill more coca plants. And first of all, I thought, this is like Dr. Strangelove. Then I thought, isn't this a little dangerous? And he put his hairy maul into his chest and pulled out his gold dog tags with all his agents who had been killed. And then I'm thinking, where have I met this guy? And it suddenly dawned on me that I had never met him literally, but I had met him 1,000 times in Medellin, the early days of the cartel. He was the cartel. His energy, his deportment, his obsession, his utter focus on cocaine. He was the same as they were. They were two sides of the same coin. And I realized in an instant, this is of course why Tim had made me go and apply for the job. This guy had no interest whatsoever in winning the war on drugs, any more than the cartel wants cocaine to be legal. It's like they'd all be out of jobs, right? And the Washington Post did this expose to sort of look at where the $60 billion spent every year on the war on drugs actually goes. Of course, it turns out that every part of the U.S. federal government has a piece of the pie. None of them want to win the war on drugs. It's like all the pot growers in Humboldt County. They're the ones most violently opposed to the legalization of marijuana. It's going to undercut their profit margin. So this whole war on drugs will one day be seen as not only an utter waste of money, but also cause of so much misery, all driven by the ideology of people who had no interest in the well-being of humans when it comes to the use of substances, illicit or licit, but only wanted to exploit this issue for their own political good. And that goes right back to the war on drugs is the biggest act of folly that I've experienced.
And it really is partly responsible for what is really one of the worst wars in our time, and that's in Colombia. I mean, what struck me so much about reading your book is how the illicit cocaine trade fueled people like the FARC, like the M19, some of these leftist groups really fueled them and empowered them. Then you had the AUC or the paramilitaries on the conservative side that would pop up like an opposing leg. And then you had the military as kind of the third leg of what was a real war. So it's so funny. We here call it the drug war, this prohibition and demonization of cocaine and things like that. But really there was a real drug war going on, fueled entirely by our consumption and by that very prohibition.
Yeah, exactly. And look, Colombia is a country like any Latin country with a great inequity. And the leftist movement that came out of the early 1960s, the victory of Castro's Cuban Revolution, there was, when I was still in Colombia in the 1970s, there was still a kind of a wave of hope where some of these leftist groups, whether you agreed with them or not, still had some element of ideological purity, some sense of trying to affect the...
They had noble rhetoric.
They had rhetoric, but they also were believers, right?
Yeah.
But we forget that, okay, the collapse of the Soviet Union, beginning in 1989, culminated immediately eliminated any support for these groups. They got rhetorical support from leftist governments in Ecuador and, of course, from Chavez, but very little material support, certainly very little from the Cubans. So they found themselves desperately in need of funding, and they were really self-supporting. Initially, they started to tax the distribution of cocaine, and they sort of started a protection racket. And then the money was just too good, and they got deeply into it, and they lost all of their credibility years ago. But meanwhile, when all of this begins, the Colombian army is weak. The nation is vast. It's an incredible mountainous nation, several times the size of France. And clearly the federal government was not in the position to protect individual landowners from the leftist guerrillas who, in order to generate money, they began initially by robbing local agrarian gangs. Then they turned to kidnapping and extortion before finally getting big time for the cocaine. During the era when they were turning to kidnapping, there was a kidnapping happening in Colombia every 3 hours of every day. And the local individuals, particularly wealthy ranchers, weren't going to put up with this. And so they created these auto defense force militias, if you will. Key thing in that was that what began as a sort of a defense of right, there's always been this between far right and far left, Colombia.
Right.
But the problem for the landowners that they saw was that the FARC could strike anywhere. There were multiple leftist groups, the MA, the MAPC, the way there are other groups. There are 6 or 7 of them. And they could strike anywhere, and the individual members of these militias could be everywhere. But they had to have their presence everywhere. And that's, in a way, how they settle, certainly not defending, on terror. And so if you wrap a man to a tree and you cut him up live with a chainsaw, eventually cut off his penis and throw it into the Magdalena River, which was one instance of their brutality, word gets around. That was the rationale. And so what happened is that you had this horrible situation where ordinary Colombians throughout the country, in all walks of life, every strata of society, was damned if they did and damned if they didn't. If they serviced the cadre of the FARC by even selling them fuel or food or renting them a mule, that would invoke savage retribution from the paramilitaries. And if, on the other hand, they helped the paramilitaries invoke savage retribution from the left. And meanwhile, the army is, at that time, relatively flaccid. And it became kind of a three-way civil war. And probably the only good foreign policy initiative of the United States over the last years has been Plan Colombia. And it only happened once the FARC turned to drugs. Once the series Narcos is accurate in this way, the CIA was focused on these leftists. That was, they were fighting Cold War ghosts, right?
Right.
The DEA were trying to stop this tsunami of drugs arriving in America. And they were at each other's throats because, one thought, the CIA thought they were on this noble, patriotic mission, and they thought the drug stuff was just police work. But once it was put together and the Americans started using the term narco-terrorists,
yes,
and it was realized the FARC was only able to subsist because it had the cocaine money, then the floodgates of American foreign aid opened until Colombia became the third largest recipient of U.S. military aid and foreign aid on the planet after Egypt and Israel. And the Colombians did quadruple the size of their army, professionalize the army, and it became a force that allowed Santos and Uribe, first in 2006, demilitarizing the paramilitaries. Again, it was a very light thing. Paramilitaries weren't about to put down their arms to walk into a prison cell any more than when Santos, 10 years later, demilitarizes the FARC. The conditions are equally light because, again, they're not going to walk out of the forest into a jail cell. And both sides were attacked for that, but both gestures were essential to bring about the condition for the peace agreement that was signed in 2016.
And what's so interesting in your book is we follow this conflict up and down the various regions of the Magdalena. And how did this period, La Valencia, and then you move into, the narco-terrorist kind of period in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, how did that impact this great river, the Magdalena? And then how is that an analog for what the people were experiencing who were caught in this vice of war?
The river became known as the cemetery of the nation. I mean, people refused to eat the fish because to eat the fish was to eat the dead. Mm-hmm. So the iconic image that Gabo Garcia Marquez writes about in his 2 novels, in which the river is not just a setting but a character, the image of the corpse floating downstream with vultures on top pecking away at the rotten flesh. I mean, that was an image of the darkness when the Magdalena was. Look, I mean, in Colombian history, to give you an overview, at the time of the revolution, during the Enlightenment, you had two forces in Colombia. On the one hand, you had those inspired by the Enlightenment, inspired by what had happened in the United States, who really had a dream of democracy in this new land. Then you had a kind of an elite who just wanted to kick out the Spaniards and enter the oligarchy in their place.
Fill those positions.
And those were sort of two halves. And that was a point of tension throughout Colombian history between liberals and conservatives. And it reached a head in the 1950s after the 1948 assassination of a man called Jorge Gaitan, who was considered the great liberator. He was sort of the poor said he was the one whose voice spoke of the wind, and their agonies, were found in his soul. And it was very beautiful. And that prompted this outrage. It was called the Bogotazo, where for 3 days, Bogota literally burned and 60,000 people were killed. And that began this big civil war called La Violencia, which tormented the country through the 1950s. And eventually there was a kind of agreement made where the two sides would trade the presidency off each year. And then during the 1970s and late 1960s, there was relative peace in Colombia. But that schism between the two halves of the Colombian reality has always been there. And it reflects the fact that, whereas, Bolivia had land reform in 1952, Peru had land reform, albeit with mixed results in 1965, there has never been serious land reform in Colombia. And in that sense, it's one of the most unequal nations on earth. And this is, again, it's kind of a structural failing. It's the same way that, Jefferson called slavery the original sin of America, that until you can deal with that, you'll never be able to finally progress. And economic inequity in Colombia is that as well, although they've made great strides in many ways. So you had this situation where, but in the 60s, again, inspired by La Violencia, the left in La Violencia, and by the success of Castro and the whole revolutionary movement in Latin America, you did have these groups being formed, the FARC, the ELN, the M19, and so on. And they then were working as revolutionary groups. I mean, the 1970s, I was plant collecting. I was arrested as a Dutch gun runner in the middle of the jungle. They thought, what the hell's the blonde kid doing here, Yeah. So the FARC, there were little skirmishes, but it was trivial. But then the cocaine thing gave the money that amped the whole thing up. And again, the paramilitary, who were responsible for 80% of the deaths in Colombia, were the ones who sort of took this to the level of incredible violence, the kind of violence that we legitimately associate with the cartels. Look, there's evil in the heart of everyone, of every society. Culture is all about enveloping individuals with a moral and an ethical body to keep that evil at bay. And when you have money involved, like the cocaine money, you just can't even begin to understand the scale of the money that was being generated. I don't care what country you are, there is going to be the creation of evil. Al Capone in Chicago perpetuated violence of that sort over alcohol. If cigarettes were made completely illegal, someone would find a way to do it with tobacco. And cocaine just was a particularly evil substance.
Well, and as you travel through the Medio Magdalena and some of these regions, what strikes me is the symbolism that gets brought up of people having these intense memories of the river and the gruesome scenes that come from the river as Colombia descends more and more into this violence.
At the same time, everybody sees the river as a symbol of hope. There's one little place on the river in a town called Puerto Barrio, where because of the currents, a lot of the corpses would get caught in whirlpools. And the paramilitaries, one way that they struck terror, and remember that their motivation was to strike terror,
right,
was to forbid anyone from rescuing anyone who had been tossed into the river. And that allowed the deaths to be double deaths, because it wasn't just a physical death, but you didn't get the last rites. You were condemned to purgatory. You could never get to the side of God. So in a deeply Catholic nation, to throw someone in the river like this was to kill them twice. And those on the shore were told that you will join them if you rescue them from the water. But in Puerto Barrio, the people said, no, you have come to us, we will look after you. And it started this unbelievable thing where thousands of corpses were rescued from unintelligible, illegible, unknown individuals, rotten, sometimes just, bits and pieces of bone. And they were taken from the water and adopted by local people and given the names of their own lost ones. And they became known collectively as Nobis Nobody, or the No Nombrado, the people without names, the NANs. And it was this kind of incredible redemptive gesture of the entire town who said, no, we will not. It was a heroic act.
Yeah.
We will not listen. We will put our own lives on the line in memory of our own loved ones. And they didn't just arrange for these corpses to be baptized. They gave them their own family name, which, Latin culture is a huge thing to do. And they basically were saying, enough, we won't do this. And if I can just give me a second here, I went to interview, there's this one museum of the Magdalena in an old colonial town called Honda. And the director of it, who's really created the museum, is a wonderful scholar called Herman. And I interviewed him, and this is what he said to me. I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena. Cauca is the other great affluent of the river, two arms that become one. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country of peace. A river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombia. A river that I loved so much, and there we were, by its waters, as peace came over the land. That paragraph, that quote from Herman, I think, sums up how Colombians feel about their mother. And that's why this idea of cleaning it up as a school of peace has caught on.
Yeah, and when you hear the testimony, especially like you said, of musicians, whether it's Maestro Villafane, Carlos Vives, the musician that showed you around, all these very inspiring people, whether it was cumbia or whether it was tambura. These musicians all had beautiful ways of seeing the Magdalena as the birthing of music, so while simultaneously it's seen for so many years as kind of this graveyard and this sign of a country at war and dis-ease, at the same time, it's this symbol of hope and this creation myth almost in so many people's minds, so I guess how cognizant are all of the people of Colombia of how important this is? Has it struck that chord, like you say in the book, The Magdalena, has it struck a chord of national pride? And then maybe talk a little bit about the resiliency of Colombian people in general. I know that's a huge topic, but to have a people that can keep hope, through this war was only the most recent in a series of revolutions and traumas that they've experienced, so maybe we can talk about how the Magdalena is becoming this central piece of Colombians seeing a new future and how they've been able to persevere.
Well, I think it's so right. And on that note, I mean, there's this feeling in Colombia that we've turned our back on the Magdalena. For example, one of the towns in the river, it's just a drop from the mountain from Bogota, the capital. And friends of mine often talk about how in the 50s, when they were kids, 60s, that their parents would take them down to cottages in the hot country, in La Tierra Caliente. And they always use the phrase, we're going down to Tierra Caliente for the weekend, right? But no one had ever said, we're going down to the Magdalena Valley. In other words, people didn't have that connection to what hot country represented. First of all, the resilience of Colombian people is overwhelming. I don't honestly think that any other people, if I can generalize in that sense, that I've experienced all of my travels, had that kind of human dignity, that capacity to maintain joy in the face of so much tragedy, which every single family has suffered. It really is deeply moving to experience. There's a tremendous sense of patriotism in Colombia, and that's why when we talk about cleaning up Magdalena, we always say don't make it an environmental battle or regulation. Don't ignore. People understood that the river was the reason the country is a gift of the river. Make that the rationale for cleaning it up. Simon Bolivar was the only revolution in history that really saw nature as part of the definition of the country. He was deeply influenced by Humboldt, great naturalist. This appreciation of natural beauty and of biodiversity goes very far back in Colombian history. And the epilogue of the book tells a lovely story where overlooking Huertas, an old shrine and retreat called Monserrate, and it's a very popular tourist attraction. And Sandra, my close friend and colleague, Sandra Uribe, who's the prominent in the book, really helped me enormously write the book. And I were up there one day, and she said something so beautiful. She said, Rio Magdalena is named for Maria Magdalena, right? And for all those years, Maria Magdalena was seen as sort of a prostitute, who only through the good grace of Christ was allowed to wash his feet with her hair and her tears. And it turns out that Pope Gregory, who condemned her in the 6th century, had the wrong woman. And the repentant prostitute in the circle of Christ was Mary of Bethany. And that Maria Magdalena, despite being saddled with this scarlet letter of sin for all those centuries, was in fact the apostle of the apostles, stood by him in life and in death, the one that he summoned to spread the glorious message of his resurrection, the one who was her very name invoked power and strength, the Magdala meaning tower in Aramaic. She was the apostle of the apostles, but it was only in 1969 scarlet letter of sin was removed from her name, and only in 2016 did Pope Francis finally sanctify her as the apostle that she is. And Sandra said to me, for all those years we treated her like a whore. Now, a generation later, billions of Catholics, Lutherans, Orthodox Christians, and Anglicans are prepared to accept that she was in fact a saint. And then Sandra said the most beautiful thing. She said, well, why can't we do the same for the river? For all these years, we treated it like basura, but it is the fountain of our lives. And if we can rekindle the sanctity of the memory of Maria Magdalena, why can't we reclaim the wonder and the purity of the river that has made possible our nation? And just when he said that, we were at a little cafe, and this glorious little yellow bird landed on our table, pecked at the crumbs of our cake, and then flew off into the forest.
A synchronistic validation of the truth and power of that sentiment. And it shows up throughout the book. And I asked about the people because there are so many beautiful and vivid characters that you bring to life throughout the book. Colombian people, whether it's your initial guide, William Vargas, this amazing self-taught naturalist, whether it's Zandra who follows you, whether it's Diana Ocampo, there's so many amazing characters. And, that really is one of my favorite parts of the book is how you interweave the real stories. I guess no surprise there, you're an anthropologist, but you weave together the real stories of the Colombian people into the story of the river. And it just makes this vivid depiction where we end up getting so much invested and we want to see, this outcome. So do you think that things are moving in that direction? That's kind of where I want to end things is what about today in Colombia? And do you think there's hope for the Magdalena?
It's a complicated question. First of all, some terrible things happened in the wake of the peace agreement. President Santos, who I admire enormously, who incidentally called me up a couple of weeks ago and he said he wants every Colombian to read Magdalena. And in the last paragraph of his own memoirs, he mentions the book. This, of course, a Nobel laureate for peace. But President Santos constitutionally could not run again in the election of 2016. And he elected to put the peace agreement to national plebiscite. He didn't have to legally, but he did. And I was in Bogota the night before the vote. The city was in a wave of euphoria, peace at last. To the astonishment of everybody, disappointment of many, the referendum failed by the narrowest of margins, a few hundred votes, right, in a nation of millions. And President Santos then, on the Thursday of that week, was awarded the Nobel Prize, which gave him a lot of moral authority outside and inside Colombia. He then did what he was always empowered to do by the Constitution, move it through the Congress, which it did, and it was signed into law. Now, that was legal, but it didn't endear him to the far right. And the rationale of the far right, who had opposed the agreement, is that the FARC were getting off too easy.
Right.
Now, the far left, or even the Santos people, and Santos had been Uribe's Minister of Defense before he turned his sight on peace. But the rationale was exactly the rationale that Uribe's people had used in 2006 to demilitarize the paramilitaries. It's not like the paramilitaries went away, but as an open marauding force, they were neutered. And that was absolutely essential because they were responsible for 80% of the murders. And more importantly, the state had to reassert itself. But at the same time, they weren't about to lay down their arms to enter a prison cell. So the terms were very lenient, as terms must be to end a civil war.
Yeah.
You just have to get on with it and forget. It's never easy. It's never right. It's never clean. It just is. You've got to move on. And so when essentially Santos in 2016 does the same thing with the FARC, the right doesn't cut him the same slack, and they resist. Now, the problem is that the actual peace agreement had several hundred clauses at a cost of $45 billion to implement. Most of the clauses were about the kinds of progressive infrastructure developments that the FARC, as a leftist group, wanted: potable water, better roads, better schools for the campesinos, etc. But because the Constitution said that Santos could not run again, a protege of Alvaro Uribe, by the name of Duque, was able to split a divided field and barely win the presidency on a platform that called for the, if not elimination of the peace agreement, the severe modification of it. And even though in the first year of peace, homicide rates dropped to levels not seen since 1975, the new presidency was at best neutral to the peace process. At the same time that oil prices dropped by a third, the main source of foreign revenue for the country, and the Venezuelan refugee crisis sent 1.8 million poor Venezuelans into the country desperately in need of support. And so the federal state at a critical moment had neither the will nor the capacity to reoccupy the spaces abandoned by the FARC during the demilitarization. Into that void went the bandidos, the disaffected FARC, all the petty criminals who were there with no interest in the federal state being back, and to establish their own fiefdoms to essentially create cocaine. And so as civil society in those areas rose up to demand implementation of the agreements of the treaty, their heads were cut off one by the paramilitaries who wanted no government presence whatsoever in the regions. And so as a result, even though homicide rates dropped dramatically in the country, even though the country itself became safe to travel in for the majority, the actual number of assassinations of individual civic leaders soared to horrific levels, as did and continuing the massacres. So the tragedy for history, a friend of mine who's Colombo-Canadian, compares Duque, bless him, as sort of the Andrew Johnson of Colombia. And if you remember, Andrew Johnson is the president who, in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, becomes president. And whereas Lincoln had called for charity for all, malice towards none, forgiveness, and Lincoln might well have been able to rebuild the nation, right. Johnson lost control of Reconstruction, provoking, amongst other things, this massive reaction by the white society in the American South, which would give you 60, 70 years of Jim Crow and the most dreadful of segregation. So Johnson was impeached for many reasons, but he was also the worst president. And I think Duque, unfortunately, will go down as someone who was weak at a time when strength was necessary. And of course, it's not at all clear who's involved in all this. Again, this poisonous wave of cocaine money that is still there, because there are more people using more cocaine in more places than ever before. It creates this dark undercurrent, right? So the question is, I don't think Colombia will ever go back to the violence that tormented it in the 1990s and the early years of the next century. These civil wars ultimately end when the majority, become collectively exhausted. That's what happened in South Africa. That's what happened in Ireland. In a way, that's what's ultimately going to happen in the United States. What's going to bring the two halves of the American reality together won't be a federal election in November. It's when people just realize that this polarization is so poisonous that it puts the entire destiny of not just a nation, but of individual families and children at risk as Americans. And then people will say enough. And so I think Colombia will never go back to the violence. Kind of peace could have happened had Santos, by chance, had another term. And had he been able to, as the winner of the Nobel Prize, go to the world and say, we need help with the Venezuelan refugees, we need help with the implementation of the peace, I think he could have raised funds and support, and we would have had a very different situation in Colombia today, where it is, again, peace remains as precarious as it's always been throughout Colombian history.
It's really incredible to think they have to balance, the very fabric of morality and society against really noble compulsions to protect indigenous peoples, to protect the environment, which you highlight in your book are so progressive and so strong and something to be lauded so much. But the fact that that's under constant threat by really forces that in America, as polarized as we are, and that was one of my questions, is where does this have echoes of what we're experiencing in America, which I guess is emblematic of much of the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, is this opposition and polarization of left and right. But to have that to such a level where it's constant violence and it's actually threatening the very fabric of the society, it's such an incredible problem to be faced with. But the one thing I leave the book with is that the people, the fabric of this nation is so strong and so resilient and has developed, maybe unfortunately had to develop, the tools to say, we put it behind us. We can only look forward, because to look back, we physically would not be able to move forward, emotionally not be able to move forward.
I think that's what President Santos meant when he called me and said he wants every Colombian to read the book. The book is not naive, as you note there. It describes and accounts and explains all these issues we've been talking about on your podcast. But fundamentally, it holds a mirror to all that is good in Colombia. And that's so essential because, I have a strange, amazing position in Colombia, which is why they made me an honorary citizen in this wonderful ceremony at the National Palace, because I'm not some kind of naive gringo saying, happy island people. I understand the history as well as any outsider. But at the same time, I also deeply appreciate, from the level of the street, where I spent most of my time in Colombia, the wonder of the Colombian people. And psychologically, they need to be able to see hope, and holding a mirror to all that is great about them, as well as what has been difficult, is one way to influence the political process, because people will only have hope if they can escape the shroud of negativity and cynicism, right? And because I do know Colombia as I do, and because I have the reputation I have as a writer, I guess as a scholar and a scientist, the lineage of Schultes, the whole works, I speak with considerable authority in Colombia, and particularly for young people. I'm not a politician. I'm not a diplomat. I've got no axe to grind. I love the country. I love the people, and the country in so many ways saved and created my life. So that's the cause of my fidelity, the source of my fidelity. And so when I do speak in Colombia, it provokes something. I mean, I've gone into events where the capacity of the hall is 500 people, 5,000. I've had families stop me in the streets and thank me, and little girls come up and touch me and stuff. It's amazing. And it points to a role of a writer, I mean, there are an awful lot of travel writers in particular who use characters, to be witty, to be snide, to be clever, or whatever. I never use a character. Every character in my books is accurately drawn, authentically drawn, but elevated to the better angels of their nature. They always come out looking their best. And that's not phony. It's because I see the best in them, even when they don't see the best in themselves. And in a way, this book, one of the great characters in this book, Juancito Betancourt, is one of these great journalists who grew up as a professional journalist during the worst of the violence in the Magdalena. He wrote a beautiful book. He loved the Magdalena. His dreams was to travel the length. He eventually did. He wrote a wonderful book called The Forgotten Ones. And he used to describe his research. He just turned up in a village and wait until he found and met someone who had something to say that the world needed to hear, which was exactly what Hemingway said was the essence of good storytelling. I think of it as sociology inspired by serendipity. And Juan was the same thing for me. And in a way, unconsciously, that became the model for how I wrote the book. I had no idea where I was going, didn't know who I would meet. One person led to another, in part because of my reputation. I was welcomed in all quarters, from fishermen to houses of the wealthy, scions of the elite. And I found that I don't judge people. Not that I'm naive. If I see someone killing someone, I will defend them. But I don't believe in polemics. I don't come into a situation to prove a case. Solutions, not enemies. And I'm interested even in the biography of a killer. No one's born to be a killer. What is it? So in a way, the Spanish translation of the book will have a different subtitle, not River of Dreams, but Historias de Colombia, Stories of Colombia. That's really what the book is. We might end with Hector Abad, who's a great friend of mine, who is probably not just one of Colombia, but one of Latin America's great writers. And he wrote a book called Oblivion in English about the story of the murder of his father. And his father was a physician, beloved of people, social reformer. And, in all of the sea of murder, there are a handful of killings that really rocked the entire nation. And the death of Hector's father was one of these. And he famously, since then, has had a love-hate relationship with Colombia that's sort of publicly known. People feel for him because of that and admire him. So when he writes in the endorsement of the book that only Magdalena could make me love Colombia again, it's a very powerful endorsement from a very, very deep, thoughtful Colombian writer.
It's an incredibly powerful book where the river is this beacon of hope. It is this storyteller that tells the stories of Colombia, because you break it down into the regions of the Magdalena, the peoples, how they were shaped by it, the culture, how it was shaped by it. And, we've just really scratched the surface on the incredible people involved. I mean, characters as large as Simon Bolivar, characters as large as Alexander Humboldt, but then the humblest fishing village on a jetty and the people who go out every day to cast their fish or cast their hooks into the sea. I mean, it really paints an incredible picture of Colombia, a diverse set of characters.
Fishing, I might say, with kites.
Fishing with kites.
Using the north wind, living in these battered shacks of sun-beaten wood, but as a gesture of despair, decorating the shacks with beautiful lines of poetry.
It's really powerful, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. If you're like me, once you start reading the initial story of Colombia, and I mean, this goes as far back as indigenous cultures to the Spanish conquest, all the various revolutions. I mean, I was feverishly addicted and basically spent about 7 hours straight reading it because it's so well written. It's so inspiring. And like I said, it's an incredibly important place, both in biodiversity, in the anthropological mirror it shows us of this vibrant culture that's been at the crux of so many critical moments in the history of South America. it's a really important book about a really important place that we don't know enough about. So I definitely encourage everyone to go get it. And where can people find more about you, Wade? Because this is just one book, one story, and so many that you tell. Where can people find more about you and your work?
Oh, Darren, I've got a website, www.daviswade.com, but also just Google my name, Wade Davis Anthropologist, and you just have to avoid the baseball star Wade Davis and the former NFL gay.
Who knows? That could be, those could be you too. Maybe just alter egos. I don't know with you. You've done so many things.
I don't play baseball. I can't pitch baseball like that guy does. He's really great, almost Hall of Famer. But, it's funny that I've got these two great characters who share a name. But if you go Wade Davis Anthropologist, that'll be me.
Fantastic. Well, Wade, thank you so much for coming on the show, really sharing a vast amount of insights, a beautiful narrative about this country that I've now come to love. And, I hope people leave this with a greater appreciation of Colombia, its people, and really take away lessons that, we can apply anywhere about the human experience.
Yeah, the only danger, Darren, of Colombia is you'll never want to come back.
I'm kind of surprised you did when you described the early parts of your book traveling around in the 70s. But yeah, just thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks a lot. Good luck to you, son.